Welcome to all, and thank you for being here this morning. I would also take the opportunity now to thank UNDP for organizing this series of e-conferences and UWTV for hosting it. My name is Lars Johansson. I am usually the Deputy Director of the ILO's Office for the Caribbean and currently acting as Director ad interim. I am pleased to welcome all of you to this fourth in a series of 5 consultations for action aimed at discussing a series of key issues related to the socioeconomic impact of the COVID-19 crisis. Today's topic is a very crucial one and central on reopening the economy. The principal aim of these consultations is, of course, to better understand how the UN system can most effectively direct its resources and integrate its actions with governments, the private sector, and other development partners and international financial institutions. So we will count on, in addition to my initial remarks, 4 expert panelists representing different sectors, which I will introduce and you will hear from shortly. After the initial presentations, we will have questions and comments, and we encourage you during the presentations to submit your questions and comments in writing in the space allocated for this on the platform you're using to participate, uwtv.org, UWTV or UNDP's Facebook pages, indicating if it's directed to a specific panelist who the question is for. And we have until 12:30 this morning for this discussion. Hopefully an hour and a half we'll be able to use well and draw important learnings from. As we all know, in order to contain the infection and avoid the collapse of health institutions and reduce the number of people succumbing to and dying from the infection, as much as possible, governments around the world, including in the Caribbean, have had to make some hard choices and implement relatively extreme measures, which basically have made economies grind to a halt. Some sectors have been fortunate enough to be able to move their operations from office to home and continue with relatively limited disruption. That's unfortunately the minority. We've all seen the stories and numbers related to businesses that have had to close permanently after not being able to carry the cost of this lockdown, the millions of people that have been furloughed or laid off, and the effect this has had and continues to have on the economy and people's livelihoods. We're also seeing a crisis that both affects the young and the old disproportionately, but in different ways. While the medical emergency has mainly affected the old, not exclusively, but the overwhelming majority of those who have succumbed to the disease are over 70. The jobs crisis is hitting the young the hardest. As the recently published 4th ILO monitor on COVID-19 and the world of work points out, before the crisis, more than 4 in 10 young workers globally were employed in one of the 4 hardest hit sectors of the economy. That's wholesale and retail trade, including repairs of cars and motorcycles, manufacturing, real estate, and other business and administrative activities. And finally, accommodation and food services, which of course is a sector that has hit the Caribbean particularly hard. Some of those sectors also have a relatively high percentage of the young women in the job market working in them, making their situation even more difficult, adding to that the effect of closures of schools and childcare facilities, making the situation for women with small children even more difficult. It's therefore important to get societies back to work as soon as possible, while keeping in mind that doing so in a way that keeps the infection rates under control, because we don't know what a new major surge causing the need for another round of lockdown will mean. It's already clear that the recovery is going to take time. It is important to do the utmost to ensure it doesn't take longer than necessary. And I would like to point to a recently published this week, that's how recent it is, OECD Economic Outlook, which showcases the added damage and duration of the economic and jobs recovery we would look at if a second outbreak occur. The Outlook talks about little economic and almost no jobs recovery in 2021 if a serious second wave occur, forcing a new lockdown period. Which is why the report talks about the reopening of the economies as an act of walking a tightrope. There are thus numerous factors and aspects to consider when starting to reopen the economy, but I would venture to two are the most important to keep in mind. For the economic damage to be as limited as possible and the recovery as short as possible, it's fundamental to reopen as early as possible, but not too early. And there is unfortunately no clear answer to this. The lockdown has been described as an unprecedented experiment. And I think it's safe to say that the reopening is also an experiment. This is something we have never done before. And also when reopening the economy, that we take all the possible measures that we have to ensure that the reopening is as safe as it possibly can be. And I will use my remaining few minutes to look at a few recommendations fairly recently published by the ILO for a safe return to work. So I will focus mostly on the occupational safety and health aspects of the reopening. I would start by recommending a visit to the ILO's webpage, where there are a few documents already, very practical documents already published, a policy framework for tackling the economic and social impact of the COVID-19 crisis, which looks at the occupational safety and health aspects and looks at the possibility of how to go about reopening. There is a policy brief on a safe and healthy return to work during the COVID-19 pandemic. And there is a guide specifically aimed at employers on COVID-19 prevention and a safe return to work. Currently, there is also a guide, a similar guide being produced, but still not finalized, for specifically targeting workers and workers' organizations. And based on all of these, a very practical little guide called Safe Return to Work, 10 action points, which I recommend highly to any practitioner that's online and listening to us. And once again, all of these are available and easy to find on the ILO's website. What they all highlight is that this is the time to use the mechanisms available for social dialogue in the different countries in the world, such as national tripartite councils, occupational safety and health councils, and at the enterprise level, joint occupational safety and health committees where these exist. And if they don't, it's crucially important to establish ways of ensuring that the reopening is a joint undertaking that involves not only government, but also employers and workers and their organizations. A safe reopening will require a number of measures, as well as awareness raising and education, to ensure that the measures and controls put in place are implemented fully and followed by all to the extent possible. And for that to have a chance to succeed, it's important that all the involved parties are involved from the very beginning, from risk assessment to development of reopening plans with the steps to be taken, including by when and by who. So to not use a lot more of the time, and very briefly mention the steps recommended for a safe reopening. First of all, a risk assessment. What are the risks? Who are at risk? And what are the prevention and control measures that need to be put in place? Is it possible to reopen in phases? All of these things need to be looked at. Then there are the so-called engineering, organizational and administrative measures that can be put in place, which basically looked at, for instance, looking at whether some of the staff can continue teleworking, or can we do so rotationally? What can we do with the physical space of work to ensure physical distancing? And ventilation, for instance, how to ensure that that is safe and proper, and also information and training of staff. Of course, as and this one is a kind of goes without saying, but I say it anyway, the regular cleaning and disinfecting of the workplace, and following that to actively promote personal hygiene among staff. And of course, make sure that the means for workers in the workplace to do so is available, such as sinks and hot water, soap, hand sanitizers, etc. provide the necessary and appropriate PPE, personal protective equipment, and train the workers on how to use it correctly. Then there is the issue of health surveillance, which includes monitoring the health status of workers, and that, of course, is something that needs to be done without violating the rights of privacy and confidentiality, but also to establish protocols to deal with suspected cases. For instance, that anyone with any symptom, not necessarily COVID, stay at home, and should be able to do so without a loss of income, and for reporting on cases in the workplace to appropriate authorities. There are also other hazards that should be taken into account because they affect the workplace. For instance, mental health. This is a very stressful period for all of us. So issues like proper spaces for rest, work-life balance, and so on should be taken into account where possible. Even thoughts of psychosocial counseling, if that is needed and possible to put in place. And of course, make sure that there are, when you do all of the other things, that there are proper mechanisms for storage and use of chemicals and disinfectants and so on, so that we don't create another hazard while dealing with COVID-19. And of course, that enterprises develop or review emergency preparedness plans. As a final point, that all of this should be continuously reviewed and updated. As I mentioned initially, this is a changing situation, and that the knowledge we have that is valid now might not be so a few months down the line. The goal, however, must always be to reopen the economy while at the same time controlling the infections, so we won't come in a situation which makes a second closing or lockdown necessary with the devastating effects that is to have. My final 2 points to mention before I hand over to the first of our presenters. Most of the economies of the Eastern Caribbean are heavily dependent on tourism. A reopening means visitors from abroad, with the risks that this brings with it, which is another reason why all the involved parties, authorities, business and workers, must be involved both in assessing these risks and developing the controls and measures to mitigate, to ensure that the return to business is safe. The second and last point, also speaking to the importance of broad involvement in the process, and also including civil society, the broader civil society in this, is informal sector workers. Difficult as it is to establish and implement all of these measures for formal sector workplaces, it is a lot more so for informal sector, both because many informal sector enterprises do not count on the necessary means to put in place the measures required for a safe return, nor are they necessarily represented by the actors that are normally around the table when measures and regulations are developed. And given the size of the informal sector in terms of employment in many Caribbean countries, it is important, if we are to contain the virus and avoid a second wave, that we find ways of raising the awareness of and educating informal sector workers, which will require a broad alliance of actors to be part of it. I will stop there, and I will hand over to the first of our panelists, which is Dr. Kari Grenade, who is the macroeconomic advisor in the Ministry of Finance, Planning and Economic Development and Physical Development of the Government of Grenada. Dr. Grenade has held positions at the Caribbean Development Bank, as well as senior economist and macroeconomic advisor, specializing in socioeconomic policy relevant research, macroeconomic surveillance and policy analysis, as well as country engagement strategy and development plan preparation and evaluation. The floor is yours, Dr. Grenade.
Thank you very much, Chair, and good morning to everyone. So I will start my presentation by just reminding us of some of the extant development realities facing the Caribbean, I think these would be important to keep in mind as we think about reopening, but not just reopening, but restructuring, because I think it is absolutely important that we think beyond reopening to fundamental resetting and repurposing of the Caribbean economies and societies. So just to remind you that the COVID crisis has collided with existing crises, those being the climate crisis, the chronic NCDs crisis, non-communicable disease crisis, and of course, our acute unemployment crisis, particularly among the young people. COVID has also compounded long-standing development challenges in the region. We know them all too well: poverty, acute gender disparities, social inequalities, macroeconomic fragilities in terms of anemic growth and high debt. And so this is the extant development context that we must bear in mind as we think about reopening. Lance touched a lot about reopening, so I'm just going to zoom in on two issues, really, two sectors and one issue. Now, we have to live with COVID. COVID is not going away. I think we have to permanently live with it because any case of COVID in any country is potentially a case in every country, given our global interconnectedness and the global nature of the pandemic. And so we have to live with this. So it's really about, as Lance says, managing risks. What are individual countries' risk tolerance and how do they manage that? And I want to just pick up a bit on the tourism sector, because as we all know, the region is one of the most highly trade and tourism dependent region in the world. And we know that our source markets are the hotspots, right? That's our reality. We know what the cities are. And so how do we really realistically and effectively reopen the tourism sector with that reality in mind? And I think just to add to what Lance said, I think there must of necessity be global cooperation, international collaboration, and a congruence of policies and protocols between the regional protocols as a collective and those of our international stakeholders. There must be dialogue and a common ground as to how the region as a collective proceeds to open the tourism sector effectively. I don't think we can open the tourism sector effectively in the absence of global cooperation and international collaboration between the regional stakeholders and our partners internationally. Because there are a lot of practical issues to contend with. For example, the duration of quarantine. Visitors come into the region for 7 days or 14 days. What is the duration of quarantine and who decides that? In terms of testing at the source and testing when they get to the destination in the Caribbean. We talk a lot about travelers having health certificate. How effective is that? Someone can have a health certificate today, declaring them COVID negative, and they're traveling to one of our destinations next week. A lot can happen between now and next week. They can be COVID positive. So there are a lot of practical issues that we have to iron out as a collective in the region and with our international partners. And I think to the extent that we can all agree that at the most optimistic scenario, tourism perhaps is not going to get back to pre-COVID levels, not before 3 or 4 years or so, thereabouts. And so it's an ideal time really for the stakeholders in the region to reimagine what the tourism sector would look like. Do we revert to the old normal, where the majority of tourism workers are low scale, low paid, where there is inadequate, in my view, indigenous ownership in the sector? And then fundamentally in the context of COVID, how do we have contactless or limit contact in the context of a service industry? really. So how do the tourism sector, hotel plans retrofit as much as it's feasible and cost effective with contactless equipment? And then ultimately, I think we must have a conversation about how do we really embed and infuse technology, advanced technology in the tourism sector. So for example, we might well see within the next 10 years or so, robots doing housekeeping or delivering food services within the hotel plans. This is not far-fetched. It's already happening in China. So I think we have to look beyond the current period as we cautiously reopen. We have to look beyond the next year or two, and what is the future of tourism. Now, I want to just touch a little on another sector, which is public transport. And really, as governments strategically sequence the reopening of sectors to, of necessity, balance lives and livelihood, and to balance the health and economic considerations, we have very real issues in the region. For example, I will just give you one example with public transport. Public transport in the context of Grenada was one of the last sectors to reopen. I think it reopened about 2 or 3 weeks after the other sectors. Now, bus operators are not allowed to operate at full capacity. So for example, an 18-passenger bus now by law should only carry 10 persons. Of course, to ensure physical distancing as much as possible on public transport. As well, operators now have to hire conductors. It's mandatory now. It wasn't pre-COVID, so that the conductors are responsible for sanitizing passengers and sanitizing the services of the buses. That's all well and good. But when we're talking about balancing lives and livelihood, we have to understand that, for example, those of you who know Caribbean, how the geography of Caribbean countries, coming from the north of Grenada to the south of Grenada, or the north of Dominica to the south of Dominica, for example, with and a bus that is not at full capacity is not economically viable and sustainable. So again, there must be middle ground found between the health and economic considerations. And I think of necessity, if we want to ensure physical distancing on public transportation and still allow for the reopening, where the majority of passengers who use public transport are in the informal sector, working class, and there are a lot of people in the informal sector, as Lan said. So, and as well as in the public service as well, generally. So I think there must be, interjected in this discussion is the whole issue of flexi time. If everyone has to go to the capital to work for 8 and everyone has to leave at 4 or 5, then how do you realistically ensure physical distance on public transportation? This is a real issue that countries are contending with currently, that we must find a solution. And I think flexi time, rotation, teleworking, these must be maintained if we have to really seriously balance health and economic considerations. Another issue that I want to talk about as we think about reopening is really how do we as a region, as a society, change cultural norms. As Caribbean people in our natural rhythms, we are not used to physical distancing or social distancing. But how do we change behaviors? There are a lot of COVID-specific regulations in countries, but police forces across the region cannot arrest people into obeying COVID-specific regulations. There have to be changes in behavior. How do we change or alter entrenched cultural norms that do not support physical distancing or social distancing? How do we normalize the wearing of masks, 6 feet apart, and those sort of issues? So I think change in societal behavior is crucially important as we think about reopening and as we think beyond reopening, as I said, because we have to live with COVID, right? So this is just a few points I wanted to talk about in terms of reopening, but I think, as I said from the onset, we have to move beyond a discourse on reopening and really talk about restructuring. Do we want to revert to the old normal that perpetuated some of the challenges and crises that I've alluded to at the onset? And the world has been under the great lockdown for the past 3 or 4 months, thereabouts. I think we need to think about the great reset, because COVID really does provide an opportunity for the region to reimagine its development paradigm, reset, repurpose, and in some cases fundamentally overhaul how we do things, our approaches to policy development, our approaches to implementation. And in that context, I just want to zero in on two broad points really before I wrap up. One is some imperatives for the new normal. And the second issue broadly is about moving from policy proposal and talk to action, so implementation. So in my view, I see a few imperatives as we think beyond reopening, as we think about Caribbean economies in the next 5-10 years or so. And I think of necessity, we really do have to have a fundamental improvement in our pandemic preparedness, and also generally a fundamental improvement in our primary healthcare system, the entire architecture and ecosystem that supports primary healthcare. I think that is quite evident from COVID. That's one of the lessons that we are learning. And so pandemic preparedness must be an integral part of the region's resilience building agenda. It's not only focusing on environmental resilience, and we must of necessity do that because the climate crisis is still very much, in my view, the greatest existential threat to humanity. And the region can ill afford to lose focus on building resilience to climate change and investing in climate adaptation and mitigation. But part and parcel of the whole resilience building agenda must, I think, pandemic preparedness must be given more prominence in the discourse and the overall agenda setting. And of course, resilience in all its forms on several fronts, not just environmental, but of course, economic, social, technological, institutional, and so on. I also think that there is a need to seriously jettison the extant economic model, which in my view isn't rooted in moral values, which perpetuates income and gender inequality, which perpetuates environmental degradation, which retards poverty reduction, and which depends on the sacrosanct GDP per capita numeric as the defining numeraire for economic development. It has not worked for us. It is not working well. And frankly, I think it perpetuates our underdevelopment. And so we really need a paradigm shift and new development paradigms that are really sustainable, that are inclusive, that are equitable, that promotes green, fairer development, that really genuinely promotes wealth creation in the Caribbean, not just income generation. So I think we really, really need to relook our development paradigms and our approaches to development and development policy making. It's really not business as usual, and we really should use this opportunity to really be more systematic in how we do things, to be more intentional about sort of development results that we want. And quickly before I wrap up, I think we really need to, we talk a lot about digital transformation, and we see the necessity of that now. Absolutely crucial. So there has to be a ramping up and an acceleration of our digital transformation agendas in the region. Because as we know, the economy and society of the 21st century and beyond will be a digital one. It is a digital one. And we have to be able to survive and thrive in a digital economy and society. And so digitization and widespread adoption of advanced technologies have to be mainstream, they have to become normalized, whether it's digital sales and payments, digitization and technology in health, in telemedicine, in education, in the agriculture sector to ensure food security and production and so on in all sectors. I think this is absolute priority. And we can't just be paying lip service to this. This has to happen if we really need to transform our economies and societies. And underpinning all of this, a very coherent institutional regulatory framework that supports digitization and the adoption of technology, and importantly as well, digital literacy. We have to increase and expand digital literacy. I just want to talk briefly on social protection systems because COVID has really exposed holes in our social safety nets. It has exposed acute deficiencies in our social protection architecture and ecosystem. Seen a lot of disparities, gender disparities, disparities with respect to the elder and elderly women. We see the extent of the informal sector. We know that it was large, but it was surprising for me, for sure, to realize the extent of the informal sector in the region and the overrepresentation of women in the informal sector. And we know that they have been now disproportionately affected given the disruptions. And so we need fundamental overhauls in our social insurance system, our social protection systems. We really need to redesign, repurpose our social insurance mechanism to cater to that reality of a very large informal sector, large segments of our working population that are daily paid, that live from hand to mouth. And so we need formal unemployment benefits programs. Currently, only 2 CARICOM countries have unemployment benefit programs, Barbados and the Bahamas. And we really need to take better care of the most vulnerable. And so we need a redesigning of social protection system and social insurance with more built-in flexibility so that someone in the informal sector can benefit from an unemployment program, but the contribution rate is different of necessity because they can't contribute as much of the income as somebody who has a permanent employment in the private sector, public sector. So we have to be really innovative and much more creative and flexible in how we treat with our vulnerable populations. And before I wrap up, one more point, I think it is crucially important because our development challenges are just too acute to keep talking about them. We've been talking about some of these issues for generations. We really need to be intentional about the development future of the region and move with alacrity to get there. So we have to move from talk to implementation. The ideas and policies and recommendations that are made in the bevy of reports and strategy documents in the region cannot self-implement. They need systematic, coherent, robust mechanisms to drive implementation. And so we really need to, given the multifaceted nature of our development issues, we have to really seriously rethink our approach. We need a systems thinking approach. We need to ensure that there's intersectoral collaboration as much as possible. We need policy coherence in the designs of development policy. And when we have gotten those correct, or at least close to correct, let us move towards concrete implementation supported by very robust coordinating entities or mechanisms, delivery frameworks to ensure that we are addressing the real development problems that affect real people in real communities. So it is time, it's an opportunity now for us to move from talk to action, given the acuteness of the realities that we are facing. So I'll stop here for now, Chair. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Grenade. A lot of food for thought, both on the reopening and particularly the beyond. looking at the longer term and using this crisis both as an opportunity to diversify and restructure, but also to make sure that we do not lose sight of other threats to the Caribbean region, such as the one that's probably the biggest of them all, climate change. Thank you very much again. We will come back to that. I think the questions are already coming in, but in the meantime, I will hand over to Mr. Clinton White, who joined the Barbados-based USAID ESC mission in September 2019 as the regional representative, coming from a leadership position of USAID in Libya. He assumed leadership of the missions portfolios in the OSCS and Barbados, Guyana, Suriname, Trinidad and Tobago, and the Bahamas. As head of USAID, he leads the implementation of the organization's priorities, directly supports United States foreign policy, fortifying efforts to stem crime and violence, and promote sustainable development growth programs. Mr. White is a career member of the Senior Foreign Service with extensive policy and public sector experience, providing advisory and technical assistance within USAID as well as host governments. Mr. White, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you, Lars, and good morning and afternoon to all. It is certainly a pleasure to be participating in this most important event organized by our colleagues within the UNDP system. USAID's Eastern and Southern Caribbean is committed to the growth and security of the region and to contribute to building resilience across several areas, and especially more so given the impact of COVID-19 on the countries. Our geographic focus, as you heard from our moderator, includes those 11 countries, and our work supports a response to COVID-19 pandemic, building resilience to climate variability and natural disasters, catalyzing the growth of the clean energy space, youth development, strengthening citizen security, and providing impactful changes to the education system at the primary level. The private sector is also a key partner and stakeholder across all of the work that we are doing. First, I would like to provide some brief context for our discussion and then outline some of the areas that we are currently engaging in helping to strengthen the region in the Caribbean. So owing to the COVID-19 pandemic, the Caribbean faces an economic recession larger than it has seen in recent decades, with the IMF projecting a 6.2% contraction this year. The pandemic is negatively impacting Caribbean economies through various channels, as we heard from our other panel and moderator, including a severe reduction in tourism, which accounts for between 50 to 90% of the GDP and employment in some Caribbean countries. Entering the pandemic, many Caribbean countries were already facing high debt, limited fiscal space to increase government spending in the event of an economic shock. And the hurricane season, which is now upon us, threatens additional shocks. Remittances are another important channel of economic impact, as they account for an average of roughly 7% of GDP in the Caribbean and substantially more in some countries. Remittance inflows to the Caribbean are falling as key source countries like the United States also face economic hardship. So observers predict an average drop in remittance of roughly 20% this year due to COVID-19. And as somebody also mentioned, the youth employment in the region, it ranges from 20 to 40% in most instances, as much as doubles the national unemployment rate. This has been exacerbated by the pandemic. The economic exclusion of youth places them at high risk of social exclusion. So programs addressing youth resilience, especially psychosocial support, like life skills training and employment, are going to be essential to overcoming these problems. And Caribbean countries would need to continue looking at all options to protect the livelihoods of populations and promote an economic recovery. So in the face of the COVID-19 pandemic, just to give you a little bit background of how the US government is working on this, the United States has already mobilized as a nation to combat the virus, both at home and abroad, committing more than $11 billion for the international COVID-19 response. USAID and the Department of State are contributing to an all-of-American response, saving lives by providing state-of-the-art American-made ventilators, improving public health education, protecting healthcare workers, strengthening laboratory systems, supporting disease surveillance, and boosting rapid responses capacity in more than 120 countries around the world. Now, here in the Caribbean region, the United States has contributed health assistance to the Caribbean for years, more than 236 million in the past 20 years in health alone. One particular example of the investment in Barbados is the Best dos Santos Public Health Laboratory, where the COVID-19 test results are determined. This opened in 2018, thanks to $6 million in financial support from the United States. Now, more recently, the United States has been mobilizing all necessary resources to respond rapidly to the COVID-19 pandemic. 2.2 million has been made available through USAID to help Caribbean countries scale up risk communication efforts, provide water and sanitation, prevent and control infectious diseases in health facilities, manage COVID-19 cases, and build laboratory capacity, as well as conduct virus surveillance. UNICEF, which is one of our implementers, for example, is working with the Ministries of Health, Social Development, and Education across the region for the safe operation of children's homes and juvenile detention centers, development of action plans for schools, and distribution of critical hygiene and prevention items such as safe drinking water containers, disinfectant, and etc. We are also focused on secondary efforts of the COVID-19 as well. We are already and have been partnering with the OECS Commission to lead a comprehensive media campaign involving videos and posters equipping parents and caregivers with information to support ongoing learning at home during the COVID-related school closures. We're also providing and helping to provide guidance and resources to parents and caregivers to connect their children with online reading material while schools are closed. Now, as we get to some of the areas to discuss programs that can support an economic recovery, there are a few that I would like to highlight that the U.S. government through USAID is actually working on and implementing in this response. There's one loan guarantee program where USAID has a loan guarantee initiative with the National Commercial Bank of Jamaica that unlocks up to $25 million in bank resources to increase lending to households and small and medium-sized companies across the Caribbean region to make investments in renewable energy and energy efficiency systems, as well as to promote economic growth and create jobs. The guarantee will enable the bank to expand such lending throughout the region, including Barbados, Grenada, Jamaica, St. Lucia, the Commonwealth of the Bahamas, Dominica, the Federation of St. Kitts and Nevis, as well as Trinidad and Tobago and other countries. Under our U.S. Caribbean Resilience Partnership, which is a collaborative effort between the United States and the Caribbean nations to build regional capacity to confront disaster response and to promote resilience. Through this initiative, which was launched in 2019, the United States and the Caribbean are partnering to improve our shared understanding of and response to disaster-related risks and strengthening community resilience. Recently, we announced approximately $12 million to support this resilience partnerships, including $2 million for the Caribbean Institute for Meteorology and Hydrology, and an additional $10 million for Caribbean Disaster Risk Reduction Program to prepare for and recover from national disasters in the Caribbean region. With this new funding, USAID will work with community-level organizations, host country governments, regional institutions, and the private sector to strengthen local, national, and regional planning and preparation for hurricanes, earthquakes, pandemics, and other calamities. The other program I wanted to highlight is the Caribbean Energy Initiative. Under USAID's Caribbean Energy Initiative, which focuses on building energy sector resilience across the region in recognition of the critical role that a steady, reliable energy supply plays in the daily economy of the region and in post-disaster recovery. Funded with an initial investment of $5 million, this planned 5-year initiative is part of the U.S. government's increasing engagement in the region within the framework of the U.S. Strategy for Engagement in the Caribbean, which identifies the Department of State and USAID's security, diplomacy, prosperity, energy, education, and health priorities for this region. Through this particular program, we will contribute to the U.S. government's efforts to boost the energy resilience of the Caribbean island nations, including the countries of the Eastern and Southern Caribbean, thereby overcoming a major remaining roadblock to the region's growth, stability, and self-reliance. And just to highlight some of the areas that this program will focus on, one is building the competitiveness of energy markets, leading to reduced electricity prices, increasing service quality, and enhancing the ability of electricity systems in the Caribbean to withstand shocks. The other area that I'd like to cover in the last area is private sector engagement. A key approach to USAID's work is the engagement of the private sector where feasible. We firmly believe that their participation strengthens programming, leverages resources, and builds sustainability. The private sector has been USAID's key partner supporting youth employment. Over 400 youth impacted by USAID's program have secured employment. The majority of the formal private sector. Social enterprise partners collaborate on workforce development training, and the private sector has also collaborated with community enhancement committees on community safety activities through cash and in-kind contributions. And as I think the other panel member had mentioned, and our moderator, the youth employment is going to be very key in terms of this recovery. So going forward, we want to ensure that USAID will continue to unlock the potential of private capital to drive inclusive growth in these areas. Specifically, we want to look to leverage our own resources through grants, technical assistance, guarantees, and convening power to help raise awareness of investment and business opportunities, to lower transaction costs, and to mitigate the risks of investments that generate positive social, economic, and environmental impact. Now, as we work toward our new 5-year strategy, we will be mapping out and seeking how we can deepen our collaboration and co-creation with the private sector, which is also going to be a key in this recovery in the Caribbean. And with that, I would just like to thank everyone for this opportunity and turn it back over to our moderator. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. White, for this very interesting expose of, from the perspective of a development partner and funding agency in the region, and how ongoing programs have or are being repurposed to also fit the current situation and brought on by the COVID-19 crisis. I will, by introducing the next speaker, who is Mr. Cleveland Thomas, the ITU's area representative for the Caribbean region. That's the International Telecommunications Union. Prior to this appointment, Mr. Thomas was the CEO for the Trinidad State Enterprise National Information and Communication Technology Company Limited. He was also the National Chief Information Officer of Trinidad and Tobago. He was Trinidad and Tobago's representative at the International Telecommunication Union for over 17 years and sat at the Caribbean region's as the Caribbean region's representative at the ITU's council or board. He has made several presentations to government officials in Russia, the Caribbean, Fiji, Botswana, and Zimbabwe, to name a few. So without further ado, I hand over to you, Mr. Thomas.
Thank you very much, Chairman, and good morning to you and to all of our viewers and listeners. I also want to join with the previous speakers in thanking the UNDP and for hosting these important sessions and for the invitations extended to us. As we have heard before, and I don't want to go too much into the pandemic because we heard quite a bit, but just as a brief reminder, the pandemic hit the Caribbean, we have heard, and a region that has been facing
Okay. Yes, excuse me, Mr. Thomas, we seem to have a problem with your audio. The sound is not coming through well. So we will shift to the next speaker while we try to sort out that problem in the background. We will then go to instead of having our fourth, we will have him third. That is Mr. Luis Francisco Thais, who is the head of the UNDP project in Dominica. Mr. Thais is a seasoned crisis prevention and recovery expert with over 20 years of experience supporting governments, civil society, organizations, and private sector building infrastructure for peace and post-disaster reconstruction. He has a Master of Arts in International Economics and Conflict Management from the Johns Hopkins University School of Advanced International Studies and a degree on Political Science from the Pontificia Universidad Católica de Chile. Mr. Thais was previously the head of UNDP's response and recovery in the British Virgin Islands. Over to you, Mr. Thais.
Thank you very much, Chair. Good morning to everybody. I would like to thank the organizers for this invitation to discuss ideas around the reopening of the economy post-COVID-19 response. While my presentation will cover key elements around the preconditions and strategies for reopening based on practices throughout the globe, I would like to first share some initial thoughts to set the context around reopening strategies. As many of you are aware, the pandemic is evolving differently depending on the region of the world we look at. While Asia seems to have achieved some degree of stability to recover its economies, European countries have but recently lifted their curfews and begun to reopen their economies and borders. Until a few weeks ago, the United States was at the epicenter of the pandemic. However, most of its states have now reopened and reinstated commercial and economic activities. The epicenter has now shifted to South America. And although the number of new cases continues to grow worldwide, for example, the World Health Organization reports that the last 5 days have shown the largest increase of infections globally, with an average of 120,000 new cases per day, countries are increasingly inclined to initiate and continue the reopening of their economies. So this draws a first trend. No matter the stage of the pandemic a country might be at, independent of whether the health crisis has been controlled or not, it appears that a decision to favor the quick reopening of the economy is there. Whether this is sustainable or not remains to be seen in the medium to longer term. However, this situation is also a clear indication that the models for pandemic control are shifting. While initial efforts focused on containing the pandemic, the emergence of new information, social practices, and experiences around pandemic control are favoring an approach based on risk mitigation. As such, the design of a new set of protocols and guidelines with a gradual normalization of new social behaviors seems to make risk mitigating strategies ripe for early economic reopening. While this model is to be tested and proven, particularly in contexts where the pandemic has yet to be contained, There are several country experiences that show that opening too early can lead to further outbreaks of COVID-19. A third and final consideration to consider when discussing reopening strategies is that the uncertainties around the pandemic are still very high. There are many questions still unanswered in terms of duration and potential recurrence of the virus, the future availability of treatments and vaccines, and more so around the extent and intensity of the social economic impacts and the looming global recession. These considerations need to be given due thought and be built in within the reopening strategies. As we will see throughout the presentation, reopening is not about speed, but about planning and science. And the pandemic is far from over. Against this backdrop, what do we know about reopening strategies? What does science and evidence tell us? We know that most countries throughout the world have relaxed their confinement measures and begun to open their economies and borders. Some with very clear-cut protocols and guidelines. Others learning and improvising along the way, risking new outbreaks, as may be happening in some Latin American countries, and perhaps, we will know in the future, in some states within the US. The scientific community and WHO have produced guidelines for the relaxing of confinement measures, agreeing as well on a minimum set of conditions for the design of reopening strategies. These conditions are critical for an orderly, controlled, and sequenced approach that aims to protect public health, recover economic activity, and prevent the overflow of capacities within national health systems. The recommendations are clear-cut and constitute the basis for the relaxing of containment measures and the successful reopening of social and economic life. These are, first, that COVID-19 transmission is controlled to a level of sporadic cases and cluster of cases. At a minimum, new cases should be reduced to a level that the health system can manage based on healthcare capacity. Second, that sufficient public health workforce and health systems capacities are in place. This to enable a shift from detecting and treating cases to detecting and isolating cases so as to prevent further transmission by putting into practice systems to identify and break chains of transmission through detecting, testing, isolating, and treating all cases. Third, the risks of outbreaks in high vulnerability settings are minimized. This requires that all major drivers or amplifiers of COVID-19 transmission are identified with appropriate measures to maximize physical distancing and minimize the risks of new outbreaks. Fourth, the risk of exporting and importing cases from communities with high risks of transmission is managed. This can be done through an analysis of the likely origin and routes of importations, the epidemiological situation of areas of origin and destination, and measures in place to rapidly detect and manage suspected cases among travelers, both at departure and at destination. Fifth, that preventive measures must be established in workplaces, including directives and capacities to promote and enable standard COVID-19 prevention measures in terms of physical distancing, hand washing, respiratory etiquette, and reducing crowds. And finally, number 6, that communities understand that the transition away from confinement restrictions and the new public health and social measures, are in place. They need to detecting and treating serious cases to detecting and isolating all cases. This is a new normal in which prevention measures should be maintained and where people should understand that they have key roles in preventing a resurgence in case numbers. Having defined the minimum preconditions for reopening, it is now important to look into the wider models used by countries to control and address the pandemic. The rationale is simple. Social and economic reopening needs to be adapted and aligned to pandemic control models, considering the economic gains in sectors that are to be prioritized. For example, a tourism-centered reopening strategy will differ greatly from one aiming at relaunching agriculture or in-country services. And so will the approaches to control transmissions risks, accelerate economic growth, or redress specific health concerns. The New Zealand working paper on approaches to the COVID-19 pandemic control presents 5 models to contain and manage COVID-19 in the short to medium term over a 1-year span. These models are currently used by different governments throughout the world. Among them, elimination, which consists in eliminating transmission until a vaccine or effective treatment becomes available. This model requires strict border controls and containment measures and has been widely used throughout the globe, being its most representative case Wuhan in China and New Zealand. Another approach is the sustained stamp it out or risk management approach, which prioritizes keeping transmission at very low rates, for example, the R0 at 1 or less, and assumes that a certain level of transmission is accepted but aggressively managed through a combination of control measures. This method has been used widely and with success in Singapore, South Korea, and several European countries. The third option is mitigation, and the aim is to develop herd immunity with over 60% of the population infected. Throughout one peak of infection occurring over a long period of time while implementing control measures to slow pandemic spread and reduce peak number of infected. This approach has been used by Sweden with some minor variants and perhaps now by Brazil. And then we have two additional, which are sequestration, which the objective is to achieve herd immunity, having a healthy population infected quickly while sequestering known at-risk populations. This approach is likely to generate health system overload, extensive additional deaths, and is riskier for populations with higher pre-existing morbidity. And finally, suppression, which aims to reduce cases to a low level until a vaccine becomes available or until the population develops herd immunity through a controlled and intermittent peaks of infection. While each model has different aims, delivery methods, risks, and implications, and control measures, only 3 of them are being widely used. However, the relaxation of containment measures and the gradual social and economic reopening will most likely compel countries to shift models throughout the duration of the pandemic and adapt them to their specific needs. A look at the evolution of the pandemic in the Eastern Caribbean shows several coincidences that make the region ripe to applying social and economic reopening strategies, which, by the way, several countries are already doing. This includes an early and swift response to the pandemic by implementing confinement and state of emergency measures, the closing of borders, and the expansion of health capacities to improve testing and tracing practices, and set up of isolation facilities and IC units. These efforts have resulted in a low number of COVID-related cases and deaths, allowing all countries in the Eastern Caribbean region to relax confinement measures, initiate gradual social and economic reopening strategies, and most importantly, to design measures to open borders and relaunch the tourism sector. For example, both Antigua and Barbuda and St. Lucia have already opened borders. An interesting caveat to highlight in this regard is that several countries will be testing their capacities and strategies to limit the importation of new COVID cases when or with the repatriation of nationals returning to the territories. One of the successful cases in controlling the pandemic in the Eastern Caribbean region is Dominica. While the country implemented early confinement measures, it quickly sought to upgrade its public health capacities in terms of equipment, treatment and isolation centers, and designing clear protocols and guidelines for testing and contact tracing. These efforts allowed Dominica to have one of the highest testing and contact tracing capacities in the Eastern Caribbean and the Caribbean, while also being able to deploy a community survey that targeted 618 households to confirm the absence of any community transmission within its territory. In connection to strengthening public health capacities, Dominica implemented an aggressive communication strategy that was vital to inform the public and secure the execution of confinement and social distancing measures. Radio and internet press conferences were organized on a bi-weekly or weekly basis. Public campaigns to alert the public on containment measures implemented, and psychosocial support was actively provided during government press briefings. This allowed Dominican citizens to become key players in containing the pandemic. Another factor of success in responding to the crisis was government's proactivity in strengthening partnerships with bilateral governments and international organizations. This resulted in the contribution and sourcing of PPEs, PCR and rapid tests, ventilators, beds, and other necessary equipment, the deployment of additional health capacities such as doctors and nurses from abroad, the provision of technical assistance, and financial grants to help alleviate the costs associated with responding to the pandemic. Throughout the duration of the pandemic, government also created a high-level multi-sectoral coordination team to begin working and designing a reopening strategy for Dominica, which not only included addressing the sequencing of a reopening transition, but also identifying the public health capacities required to relaunch the tourism industry. This coordination team took expert advice and held consultations with international and local experts while keeping up with best international practices and policies. So based on the experiences of Eastern Caribbean countries and Dominica in particular, we could agree that the following conditions are critical to secure a smooth and sustainable reopening. First, a strong public health system. The successful reopening of social and economic activities and borders will demand strengthened capacities in terms of medical facilities, equipment, isolation centers, augmented ICU capacities, protection of medical workforce, among others. Second, a tested and trusted surveillance systems. The opening of borders will require governments put into place very strong testing, tracing, and surveillance mechanisms. In the hypothetical situation of an influx of imported COVID-19 cases, it will be critical to trace and isolate all cases to prevent community transmission. This will necessitate of an increased workforce. Third, an active communication and information strategy. Efforts are required to extend public communication and citizen participation mechanisms to secure that population stays informed, actively participating in surveillance measures, and fully engaged in the implementation of new containment mechanisms. An important aspect of the strategy is also to prevent misinformation that may lead to non-compliance with health and social measures. 4. International and regional cooperation arrangements. Jump-starting social and economic activities that involve travel, movement of goods and services, and tourism will require increased international and regional cooperation to support the harmonization and coordination of safety, security, and health protocols and procedures. For example, tourism protocols are already available and should be agreed by the region and between receiving and originating countries. Fifth, community protection. Individual and collective protection measures need to be put into place to avoid at all costs community transmission. And finally, new rules of coexistence. Citizens and all of us need to adapt to new social practices that can contribute to containing and mitigating the pandemic. And to these, I would like to add the importance of not rushing. Social and economic reopening is not a 100-meter sprint competition, but a 42-kilometer marathon that requires staying up to date with best international practices, carefully sequencing and planning every single step, and above all, endurance and perseverance. So, Eastern Caribbean has to offer to the world, particularly to countries and local governments that are still battling to control the pandemic, in Latin America. So some of these lessons are the early application of confinement measures, including closing of borders, together with the reinforcement of health capacities, helped control the extent and intensity of the pandemic in the region and thus made it manageable. Second, the strategy deployed to test, contact trace, and isolate COVID-19 cases were highly effective. This approach could be scaled and replicated in other countries of the world, particularly in Latin America. Third, listening to science pays off. Eastern Caribbean countries stuck to the advice of science and best international practice, and it worked. For example, the lack of new COVID cases did not translate into an immediate relaxation of measures, and on the contrary, OECS countries took the necessary time to evaluate and rethink next steps. Today, the Eastern Caribbean is in a unique position to begin its economic recovery and resume economic activities. Finally, regional and international cooperation mechanisms are vital. Coordination and collaboration among OECS countries and presence of international cooperation through technical assistance and grant support has been an important asset to control the pandemic and will even be more important for economic recovery. Coordination among OECS countries will also be paramount for the execution of durable reopening and tourism strategies. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Thijs, for this comprehensive overview, and also for the very concrete example on the measures that are being taken in Dominica specifically. Given the time we have left, I will not waste any more time, but just hand back over to Mr. Thomas for his presentation. Thank you.
Thank you, Chairman. And again, my apologies. I don't know what happened technically there. I want to join with the previous speakers in thanking the UNDP for hosting these important sessions. And because of time, I would not go into too much details about the impact of the pandemic to the Caribbean. And we have heard before that we were already facing a pandemic of a different kind in the Caribbean. And we speak to things like the high level of indebtedness, our over-reliance on a few sectors like tourism, fishing, imports. And we also have the challenge of poor infrastructures, whether it's road, healthcare, food, security, etc. So we do know that there is also this challenge is exacerbated further by a shifting philosophy as it relates to international trade and cooperation. We are seeing an accelerated tendency of protectionism and nationalism rather than liberalization and free trade, making it so much more different and difficult for the Caribbean. Each government has to do that delicate balancing act of ensuring that the highest level of healthcare and safety is balanced with that restoration of their economies at the earliest and most opportune time. How do they do that? What are they to do today? And this is why our colleagues, the previous speakers, give tremendous rich contribution. The ITU is the UN Specialized Agency for Technology. And as regional head of the ITU, I want to focus for a few minutes on ICT and technology and the contribution it can make in opening the market and the steps that we can take. As a first point, we all are aware of the extremely crucial role that ICT played during the past few months in keeping us all connected. Whether it was healthcare updates, the do's and don'ts during the pandemic, moving education online, purchasing our goods, our groceries, or just social distance measures requirement and perhaps interaction with friends and families. Watching a movie keep us sane. It is unimaginable what the world would have looked like without the internet and ICTs. Technology, without a doubt, helped us during the pandemic, and it has a place even more so when we open back. And it is a critical component to build back better. How do we build back better as a region? From a macro perspective, I believe that since countries have limited resources and they can't do everything at once, it would be tremendously helpful if we have good leadership. I think that's a critical component, good leadership, to build public confidence and to send the right international message to potential investors that we are ready and we are open for business. We need good leaders. The regional leaders demonstrated excellent leadership in the manner in which they have handled the pandemic. And this is evidenced by the low cases of transmission and deaths in the region. Leadership is a critical component. We also need to develop and continue to update national recovery strategies with public consultation and collaboration with the private sector. My colleagues before spoke about the need for healthcare experts to work with corporate business and the government, including John Public. People must be part of it. We need also to engage the support of international organizations, the UN, the EU, UNAID, UNDP, ITU, etc. And I do believe that it is important too, as another point, to set out the plan over some timelines. We can't do everything one time. We need to say there are some things we are going to do immediately, some things we will put in short, medium, or long term. And what are those things we're going to put immediately? Are those manufacturing, healthcare, security, tourism? What should go first? What should go midterm? We also have to search for alternative financial mechanisms and initiatives and generate new revenue streams apart from what we are doing right now. We have seen and heard prime ministers in the region talking about debt forgiveness, reclassification measures for entitlement of grants and underfunding. So the governments in the region have to do that, and they really have to have a phased approach for the relaxation measures in the restriction according to each country's special circumstance. And from a macro perspective, I do believe there is that need for continuous information, educations, and measuring our progress. And at some point in time, don't forget to celebrate our successes. So from an ICT perspective, what can they do as we open? An impressive amount of social and economic activities must continue to go online. We have seen that because of the social distancing, that there was a need to buy online. PriceSmart, for instance, introduced their click and go online shopping. Sagicor extended insurance claims to telemedicine, and also other new applications developed in order to continue to carry their businesses online. Governments and regulators can help by introducing new policies and regulation and legislative measures that facilitate rapid expansion of an upgrade of ICT facilities. We within the ITU, we have launched a platform to pool experiences and innovative policies and regulatory measures like Direct for COVID or CYB for COVID. We share information of what others are doing, actions, resources, projects, cybersecurity, design all to help the community to connect safely and securely together. The plan for today's economy should be to invest in technology more than we have been doing before. I don't know if you as a listener out there are aware that even though the technology is so important within the Caribbean region, investment in ICT is less than 5% of a country's GDP, less than 5%. Yet this sector played such a pivotal role in keeping us connected during a pandemic. There are still thousands and billions of people worldwide that are unconnected, but we don't have the necessary skills. AI-powered tools can predict the spread of the virus by using data on confirmed cases and integrating it with publicly available information, including airline ticketing and data and local news report. We have innovative businesses, 3D printers, providing and producing masks, including attachments for breathing masks on behalf of medical companies. Our youths, there are a lot of young men and women in the Caribbean. There's a need for an innovation center. It's right to build upon it. Right there, we have seen there's a bureau set up in the US, in Michigan, that are not just introduced a new app. And that app is to do what? To help businesses to restart in their start and how they reopen, to help them connect to other businesses to find personal protective equipment as well as other information that they can get. Tracking tools only through technology, entrepreneurs, and the imperative for developing countries, small businesses, CARICOM, creating the digital single ICT space, an opportunity that it is there. Cloud computing, important. Investment in digital infrastructure to connect schools. We have started GIGA, a project to connect schools. We are working to build content, emergency telecoms, apps like virtual vision, smart sea initiatives to help us in the hurricane season. Data mining, and don't forget cryptocurrencies, unlike the traditional currencies and financing that we know. Again, it's important to have excellent leadership. Because of time, Chairman, and in closing, we at the ITU continue to do our part with many governments and agencies. We are available. The Caribbean has suffered a series of disaster crises in the past. As was the case in the past, as a united, resilient, faithful, God-believing people, determined we will emerge out of this better. And as I before, we shall in fact move to build better and get back there even greater. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Thomas. I will go straight to a couple of questions. We have very little time left, so I will remind the speakers to whom the questions are that we have are addressed to try to be very brief in their answers, because at 12:30, which is less than 9 minutes from now, we will be cut off whether we want to or not. So we will have to wrap up before that. The first, we have many questions, but we're trying to sort of group them together. The first one is from UVTV, and it is mainly to Dr. Grenade, I believe, asking what the specific steps that are needed for the countries in the region to seriously diversify their economies, either by expanding tourism markets to reduce concentration risk, as well as diversifying away from tourism into other sectors, given the long-term risk of COVID-19. I know it's a very hard ask, but could you respond to that in 2 minutes, max?
Okay, I'll try. I mean, I don't think it's thanks for the question. I don't think it's practical and feasible to move away from tourism altogether, but certainly tourism cannot be the only egg in our development basket. It is much too vulnerable and susceptible to shocks. So, I mean, we have to leverage our natural resources, our environment, and so renewable energy. I think renewables is definitely the way to go. We need to deepen our agenda there. And of course, we need to also look at what we are good at, what we have comparative advantages in. And there's a lot of sectors that we can look at. And we also need to think about what are some of the new COVID-inspired businesses, whether it's mobile hairdressing, mobile barbers, mobile pharmacies. There are a lot of opportunities now that COVID is throwing up that could really underpin a renewed economic development paradigm for the Caribbean beyond tourism.
Thank you very much for that answer. The next question is also from UVTV, and it is to Mr. Cleveland Thomas. Regarding schools and other educational institutions, should they seek to go fully digital, or should a face-to-face approach with the necessary protocols be used? From an ICT perspective, what would be required for schools to transition either fully or partially to an online system, given the current levels of internet penetration and computer access across the region?
Thank you very much. In 1 minute, no, we can't go fully digital. We have to remind ourselves that there are some people who do not have access to the internet, and they do not have access because of economic or other conditions. So we will have to continue to provide and make provisions for those students who unfortunately are at that place. What do we need to do? First, there must be a vision, leadership. One of my colleagues, I think Dr. Kari said earlier, too much of talking and talking and talking. We have to get policies in place. We have to teach our teachers. There are teachers who don't even know still the components, how to use Zoom and some basic components. So we have to train our teachers. We have to have the network. Governments need to invest in the network, partner with institution, and then we have to have the right content. How do we get that content online and have it shaped in a way that is culturally sensitive, etc. So quite a few things that can be done, but it is a process. Our GIGA project that we have just started with the OECS Barbados, it's an excellent program that will go over a number of years. Would consider it. Over to you.
Thank you very much. In 1 minute, any of the other panelists, if you would like to comment on any of these two questions, this is the opportunity. No. Okay, then I will go with a third question. Sorry. Right. 1 minute.
Yes. Okay. No, I was just going to say that in terms of the technology, I also fully believe and agree with that. And one of the things that we're doing when the COVID hit was, we have an early learning program and providing assistance and teacher training and tools. And because of the COVID, we were able to shift all of that work virtually with the OECS. To be able to provide and continue that program. And so as we're moving forward, we want to see how we can continue to build on utilizing IT and digitization across the board, as my colleague had mentioned, because this is a very critical area that we should be looking at and working on, and AI and machine learning are going to also be very important to this as we continue to build out, especially after the COVID-19, but even more so with the resilience. Over.
Thank you very much. It is time to start wrapping up. I will start doing that by answering in 30 seconds a question for me, which is about what steps the governments and development partners can take to reduce informality, given the importance of doing so in the context of reaching the informal sector, and how to do this in the context where some of the issues that contribute to informality, such as high taxes and labor market inflexibility, are deeply entrenched. It's a long and complex question to answer, but I would say that the starting point would be to look exactly at those issues. What are the factors that stop or basically propagate an informal sector, large informal sector? What is it that doesn't make it worthwhile for informal sector businesses to be formalized, and then start working on those? I'm sorry, that was a very, very brief and not very complete question to a large problem. With the time left for me, the only thing that remains is to thank all the panelists and all of you who participate in this exchange. I personally think it's been very rich and very interesting. We've heard about how to use this opportunity to address the numerous environmental and economic challenges that are facing the Caribbean beyond COVID-19, including the high dependence of many countries on one sector. Use this as an opportunity for a reset. Also a reset with the development community and address the particular vulnerabilities of small island development states, which we find many in the Caribbean, which is something that's not possible to measure by looking at GDP alone. On reopening, learn from those who are ahead in the timeline, like Asia, Europe, both the successes and the mistakes. Also the importance of leadership, of investing in technology and ICT, where the Caribbean is currently not doing enough. So once again, thank you very much, presenters. Thank you to the resident coordinator and for UNDP for organizing this, and UVTV for hosting, and also to all of you participants. Thank you very much.
Thank you for watching. We hope you enjoyed this program. Remember, you can watch this and all our programs on our website, www.uitv.org, available anytime, anywhere, and on any device. Also, join the conversation on social media by visiting our Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram pages.